Jason, thanks very much for coming in today to talk about the diagnostic side of assessment literacy. In earlier videos, we've talked about different types of assessment, and we've looked at how initial assessment is a bit different from diagnostic assessment. And traditionally, initial assessment will be where we're getting a rough idea of a student's ability, but a diagnostic assessment is finding out in a bit more detail about what they can and can't do. What's your experience of using diagnostic assessments?
Well, for most language teachers, diagnostic assessment and initial assessment are very closely related. Mm-hmm. Diagnostic assessment is, if you like, a more fine-tuning of the initial assessment. And just like a doctor might need to do a diagnosis of a patient of what symptoms they're presenting, if you're a teacher, you need to know exactly in what detail about how the learner is able to use the language that you're teaching, English in this case, what their strengths and weaknesses are. And this is something that can happen both before the course of learning starts. So if we're talking about students in school, it may happen before the academic year, mm-hmm. Or it could happen during the first part of the course, so that the teacher and the learner are collecting data, or they're learning about the needs of the learners during this early part of the course. So it's something that we often in language teaching refer to as needs analysis. But needs analysis could kind of include a lot of different things in there, including the initial assessment.
So include other things. I mean, I imagine that one of the things it's going to need is include is, as you say, what they need. Mm-hmm. But to a certain extent, what they want to learn and maybe their interests as well, perhaps.
Yeah, so for any student, their needs in terms of what a teacher might perceive as being where they can improve their English most effectively, mm-hmm. in order to do what they want to do with the language, might be different from what they actually want in terms of their perceptions of their needs, uh-huh. and their interests in terms of what they enjoy doing and how they enjoy interacting in the language. Sometimes we find that because, for example, when I speak a foreign language, there are certain things I like to talk about. Uh-huh. I'm actually really strong in those areas. But in fact, if, for example, for my work, for my future job I'm planning to get, I might be quite weak in other areas that in fact I need more. Mm-hmm. So this difference between what you enjoy talking about, or what you enjoy using the language to do, and what you actually feel, or what is perceived either by you or the teacher to be your weaknesses and areas that you need to improve, may not always be the same thing. So that's the difference between the needs and the wants and the interests of the learner.
And I suppose with that, I mean, you touched on it, about how people like to learn as well, and maybe in a needs analysis or diagnostic assessment, it's sometimes good to find out whether someone prefers to learn in groups or individuals by mm-hmm. themselves. Is that would that fall under diagnostic assessment, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. And this is what we tend to call nowadays learning preferences, uh-huh. something which had this overlap with learning styles which tend not to be supported so much in the literature and the discussion of learners' needs. But definitely learning preferences, because irrespective of how I may actually learn most effectively, if I'm learning in a way that I enjoy, then that's likely to help me to learn more effectively. So if both the teacher and the learner can become more aware of these mm-hmm. things, about where the learner enjoys learning, what kind of homework they like doing, and even which other students they like to interact with in the class, that can help the teacher to work out how to teach more effectively, which is what it's all about.
Yeah. And I suppose at this point it's maybe worth briefly touching on the difference between doing a diagnostic with adults and with children as well. Absolutely. Because I imagine there are going to be different motivations involved there.
Yeah. So adult learners typically, at least in language teaching, we associate adult learners with often private education. So they've often paid for a course, mm-hmm. and the reason they've paid for the course they will often know. So they will have a reason for studying, an instrumental reason, that might be to improve their job prospects, to get a qualification or whatever. Even at higher education level, where they may have been enrolled in a course as part of their general education, mm-hmm. they're still going to be more aware of that. The contrast there is to the motivation of younger learners. When learners are a bit younger, they're often learning a language in school simply because it's part of the curriculum. Mm-hmm. And therefore the child themselves may not have any personal motivation for learning the language. And I remember that with my own learning of French at school, that I didn't actually know why I was in that class or why this language might be important for the future. And as a result, The learners in that kind of class are likely to need some kind of intrinsic motivation from the learning process, so that if they enjoy the lessons, if they enjoy using the language, if they enjoy interacting in the language, they're likely to learn more. So you see there's a kind of a difference in terms of motivations, and exactly how we talk about the motivation of the learners that will influence the degree to which you choose to do certain things, which is all part of the diagnostic assessment.
So that diagnostic is covering their needs, their wants, their interests, learning preferences, and really their motivation. That's what a really good diagnostic would do altogether.
Yeah.
Now, speaking about these, the needs and finding out what they are, in language assessment, we might look at the 4 skills, speaking, reading, writing, and listening. And perhaps it might be easier for us to talk about productive skills and receptive skills. How do you think it's best to diagnostically assess productive skills?
So productive skills we're talking about when you're producing language, so speaking and writing, as opposed to receptive skills when you're receiving language, listening and reading. So when it comes to productive skills, obviously the natural and the obvious way to assess these in any context, whether it be diagnostically, formatively or summatively, is to get the learners to use the language. So this, and if we're talking about, for example, productive skills, there's a big difference between speaking, which tends to happen dialogically, in other words, often 2 or more people together in a dialogue, compared to writing, which we tend to actually do the actual writing on our own, which is then communicated afterwards. Although, of course, in the computer era, this is now changing, and often writing can be very similar. It's a very simultaneous kind of dialogic event. But when it comes to this kind of assessment, then the initial assessment will have taken place, usually, that we know a little bit about what the learner can and can't say in the language. But once you get the learners into a class, the typical diagnostic assessment that's likely to inform the teacher and to inform exactly what the course of learning is likely to involve, or how it's going to be adapted to the needs of the learners, will involve the teacher often involving the learners in speaking activities, in writing activities, and then either the teacher themselves assessing that, or just as likely getting the learners to self-assess their own writing, their own speaking, so that they think about what they can do with the language and what they can't. So if we look at, say, an elementary class, we'll find that the learners may have, for example, a group of adult learners may have some confidence with ordering food in a restaurant in English, but they may have much less confidence when it comes to giving their opinion diplomatically in English, in a conversation or even an argument. And that will inform the teacher and the learners about where there is room for improvement, what they want to be able to do in the future, and that will help them to see the path to get there.
So I suppose we could either just essentially give students a checklist to say, can you do these functions, for example, or you could set a task which gets them to produce it, and then the teacher can see whether or not the students can indeed produce whichever function the task is requiring.
Absolutely. And these checklists exist, but there are always a few issues with giving those to a student. First of all, if you're giving them to a student in a language that's not their first language, so learners of English, that would always be true, it might be dangerous that they may even misunderstand what the items are. They may be embarrassed or unsure about whether it's okay to admit that they can't do certain things, or simply they might misunderstand it altogether, and they might just put down the wrong item. So a really useful way of actually finding out about those needs would be to get the learners to actually do something with the language, and then for the teacher and the learners afterwards then to think about, so how well did you do this? Where did you have difficulty? What kind of things do you need to be able to do it more effectively in the future? And that could include bits of vocabulary, bits of grammar, or even something else.
And I suppose that those tasks that we can set, if we think about the kinds of things teachers can do, if, let's say, an initial assessment was roughly graded a student at B2, then we can then take, once we've got selected the student from all the levels and say, okay, they're roughly B2, we can then get a specific B2 assessment, maybe even from an exam board or something, and then get the student to do the tasks in there, because that will naturally be assessing the kinds of functions and lexis and grammar, as you suggest, that you'd expect a student to be using at that level.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that would be one way of doing it, and of course we can use exam-related material in any type of assessment. You can use it in diagnostic assessment.
And I guess a similar thing for receptive skills, that you could just use a roughly tuned assessment, find out what they can and can't do with that, and then through analysis, maybe discussion with the student afterwards, you can find out which questions they found easy and difficult and why, and then that would give some indication of their receptive skills profile.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, as well as the skills, there are other things we need to check the student's ability with as well, aren't there?
Absolutely. So I mentioned it just a moment ago, but if we talk about skills, then that's our ability to use the language. As we said earlier, the 4 skills of reading, listening, receptive, writing and speaking, productive. But there's also, if you like, the underlying knowledge about the language that we have. And typically this is broken up into 3 areas. You could argue for a 4th one, but the 3 areas are usually seen to be grammar, pronunciation, which is also called phonology, and vocabulary, which is called lexis. And some people will also say that there's discourse as well, how we use language in longer stretches. But let's focus on those 3 to start with. So when it comes to grammar, most of us have a really good idea of what that means. And that could be the ability to use language, different tenses, for example, the present tense, past tense and future tense. Or it could be to do with the ability to use prepositions correctly in a sentence. Phonology or pronunciation, that can be simply a learner's ability to make themselves understood in a specific situation. And today we don't just assess that comparing it to native speakers, we assess it comparing to a more international model of English that assesses whether the learner can make themselves intelligible in a given context.
And I guess, just sorry to interrupt briefly on the phonology element, I think it's good to remember. I remember when I did my cert TESOL many years ago, it was quite a revelation to me that students couldn't produce certain sounds I thought were they're just natural English sounds, or the vowels, for example, in English, and that some students only had like 5 or 6 pure vowel sounds and had trouble actually pronouncing sounds which were easy for me. And that was quite a surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we often see, for example, students from certain nationalities having certain challenges with the language, and as I mentioned earlier, those students will often have different challenges to other students in a multilingual class. If the students all share the same first language, then the challenges are also going to be shared a little bit more. Phonology or pronunciation is the second one. And then the third one is lexis, or vocabulary. And this basically is the stuff that we put in dictionaries. So David Crystal calls it the Everest of language, for good reason, because a language like English, depending on how you define a word, could have several 100,000 words in it, of which even native speakers may only know 20, 30, 40,000. And yet, to learn a language, what we need to actually identify, if you like, from, again, going back to the question of diagnostic assessment, is which bits of language are going to be most useful for this learner to do what they want to do. So it's not just a case of whether they do or don't know a certain bit of grammar, but whether that grammar is actually functionally useful for them with what they need to do with the language. And whether they do or don't know some obscure vocabulary may not be relevant compared to common words and expressions which they may think they know, but in fact sometimes they may use them incorrectly, or they may not realise there are ways to use them that they're not making use of. And those are also all part of our understanding what the learner's currently able to do with the language, how they're able to use all these bits of the system, as we call it, grammar, pronunciation and vocab, together when they're actually using skills in an integrated model of language use.
And that brings us, I think, nicely onto our final point about setting of goals, really, for students. And that a big part of the diagnostic assessment is not only helping teachers see where students need to develop and how they can help them develop with their language skills, but also helping students themselves see what they need to be able to do to get to their next level.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we've got raising their awareness as becoming an important thing. We can raise their awareness of how they're currently using language, and we can also raise their awareness of what the kind of language use that they want to be able to achieve is like. And so we can do things like getting them to, when it comes to speaking, for example, skills, we can get them to record themselves so that they can actually see how they come across and see if they're happy with that, or see if they notice anything. And often when we're not in the middle of the process of using a foreign language, when we're actually watching it back, we can often see a lot about that. And that's a really simple but obvious way to raise learners' awareness. And in current technology kind of informed eras we live in, it's very, very easy to do that. Students can even use smartphones in an adult language learning class, is a useful way of doing that. Then when it comes to kind of the way that this helps the teacher, as well as raising the learner's awareness of where they are and where they want to get to, it can help the teacher, most importantly, to plan the course of learning, which if we were to look at the kind of the core reason why do diagnostic assessment, and that is to answer the question, what do they need to learn? And the challenge here is always that the teacher may have complete freedom to decide what they need to learn. So in other words, again, let's go back to the adult group of learners in a private language school. The teacher can find out from all of them about their needs and can plan a course based entirely on that, obviously balancing between the needs of different learners in the class. Or if they're working with younger learners, they also have to think about, especially if they're in a national curriculum environment, so in other words, in a primary or secondary school somewhere in the world, then the teacher always has to bear in mind the syllabus and the exams that the learner will face at the end of that. But the diagnostic needs for those younger learners may not define exactly what they need to learn, because that's still defined by the curriculum, but what path and what order they need to learn those things in, that will enable that teacher to help those learners to get to where they're going as effectively as possible.
Brilliant. Jason, that's been really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.